It's Paul Richardson here again, and in this session I'm going to be discussing the European Aviation Safety Agency, the regulations associated with it. This is part one of two parts. Shown here are the early days of pioneering air transportation, and it's the first Orville and Wilbur Wright brothers aircraft flight in 1903 at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. A lot of trial and error and development work occurred, but there were not many regulations. They used a falling lead weight to help launch their test aircraft from a rail launch system and temporary undercarriage using their modified 12.5 horsepower four-cylinder engine. It managed an altitude of over 800 feet. A convention on international civil aviation was signed at Chicago on the 7th of December 1944. 53 governments were invited to attend this convention, and there were 955 attendees in a big hotel. The conference lasted 7 weeks. The convention established specific principles in order to develop international civil aviation in a safe and orderly manner. It also ensured that international air transport services were established on the basis of fair opportunity for participating countries. Today, 193 countries are ICAO members. This convention was a challenge, as there are many differing opinions, including the USA, Canada and the UK, who were not able to agree on some aspects of commercial aviation, where the USA wanted complete market access without restrictions. Eventually, things settled down, although it did extend the proposed 25-day conference to 37 days. The outcome of the convention was the formation of the International Civil Aviation Organization, a Canadian-based agency of the United Nations. ICAO issues standards and recommended practices, also known as SARPs, to member states. This encourages global safe aviation and developing international flights between countries. ICAO standards relate to aircraft design and use, airports and engineering matters. A few countries or territories are still non-members of ICAO because they've chosen not to be part of the United Nations. Liechtenstein and Vatican City are two of them, Kosovo is another one, and the Palestinian territories are another. Taiwan left the United Nations in 1971 after China joined. The fundamental right to land an aircraft in a foreign country is one of the rights negotiated by ICAO. Now there are, as I've said before, 193 members. The latest to join was Dominica in the West Indies in April 2019.
Elvis, do the other soldiers give you a rough time because you're famous?
No, sir, I was very surprised. I've never met a better group of boys in my life.
Whilst Elvis Presley was joining the Army in 1958, the Federal Aviation Administration was being formed in Washington, D.C. The FAA's job was to have the final say in anything air traffic or air safety related in America, and they use federal aviation regulations to enforce this. Some of these references align with European legislation naming, but they differ in content over so many aspects that they're not interchangeable. In June 2019, a safety conference held in Cologne aims to find a pathway to the 21st century in international aviation between the FAA and EASA.
She flies like a bird in the sky. She flies like a bird, and I wish that she was mine. She flies like a bird, only on high. I see her fly. No, I can't.
Slimming Magazine approves Nimble as part of your calorie control diet because Nimble is real bread but lighter, only 40 calories a slice.
Whilst ladies were flying around with loaves of Nimble bread, 1972 saw the formation of the UK Civil Aviation Authority. Based in London, Gatwick, Manchester, Luton and Stirling, the photo shows their 1960s modern offices in London, which they've used since 1975. It is a Grade 2 listed building. The CAA regulates 50,000 pilots, 12,400 engineers and 19,000 UK registered aircraft. UK aviation regulations stem from an Act of Parliament originating in 1920, which gave the British Empire the authority to control air navigation in the Commonwealth countries and territories. This led to the Air Navigation Order, which is in use today, also called Cap 393 ANO 2016. Previously, the Civil Aviation Authority Regulations 1982. Prior to the CAA, the Air Registration Board were the governing body. Since 1972, the CAA have produced a large number of technical reference publications giving CAA guidance on many aspects of aviation safety, maintenance or operations. Safety and operational directives are CAA directives regarding aircraft or equipment. Safety notices are details clarifying safety risks with equipment or procedures, and airworthiness directives are issued to address unsafe conditions. An emergency airworthiness directive is published when urgent safety matters need to be addressed. EASA was formed in 2003 whilst the Airbus A380 was being built in France, ready for its first flight in 2005. It can carry up to 850 passengers, but it's usually configured for just over 500. The aircraft was delayed 2 years in production, and on delivery it was initially well received by customers and passengers, but over time the initial orders were cancelled as customers preferred smaller aircraft offering greater flexibility and economy. An announcement in 2019 was that the A380 production would end in 2021 after building around 200 aircraft. EASA changed its formal name in 2019 and is now known as the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, although their subtle change is only reflected in the text below their normal logo, which is shown here. EASA staff compose of more than 800 aviation experts and administrators from all EU member states. Their head office is in Cologne, which is in Germany. 3 other international permanent representations for EASA are in Washington, Montreal and Beijing. There's also a temporary office in Brussels. Many countries who are not EASA members either have a technical cooperation or memorandum of understanding to permit better flights to or from Europe. This encourages tourism or trade. EASA regulates the 32 member states and to ensure the highest common level of safety for EU citizens. Specifically, EASA excludes ultralights and experimental aircraft which are regulated through the National Aviation Authority of the individual member states. There are currently 32 member states in EASA. Croatia was the last to join in 2013. 4 countries, Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway, participate in EASA and are now members of the Management Board. They are known as the 4 European Free Trade Association states, or EFTA. Other non-European countries can be referred to as Pan-European partners. That's PANEP for short. We've mentioned the EASA headquarters in Cologne in Germany and the 3 international permanent offices around the world, but a number of countries who are not EASA members have either a technical cooperation or a memorandum of understanding to really encourage tourism or trade between those countries and Europe. The origins of current EASA regulations stem from the ICAO standards and recommended practices, the SARPs we mentioned earlier on. They're contained in the ICAO annexes. The basic regulation EU 2018/1139 sets rulemaking for aircrew, airports and contracts. There are many EASA regulations, EU 965/2012 for operations, and some other regulations for aircrew are not really going to be part of our discussions today. On the other hand, EU 1321/2014 has a great deal of maintenance-related information and regulations. A separate regulation, EC 748/2012, covers Part 21, or the manufacturing and design of aircraft and components. Bristow still holds Part 21, Subpart J authorization for component or modification design, Part 21, Subpart G for production, and that's component manufacture, is no longer held by Bristow. EASA regulations are constantly evolving, and recent amendments were published for these highlighted regulations. We will look into some of these a little bit later on. EASA decided to set up the Commission to regulate aviation in 2002, and EASA opened for business in 2003. The basic regulation sets out the high-level objectives. Rule number 1, of course, is to follow the rules. EASA regulates by order of the basic regulation, and the EASA regulations are all date-coded like EU 1321/2014. This contains all the continuing airworthiness regulations, and it also includes maintenance, licensing and engineering training. EU 2015/1018 is initial airworthiness. This includes aircraft and component manufacture and design, and it's usually referred to by everyone as Part 21. EU 965/2012 is a regulation covering aircraft operations. It includes a number of annexes. The subsections of EASA regulations are referred to as annexes, which are numbered in an unusual sequence. Recently, the Operations Regulation EU 965/2012 was updated to include a requirement for random drug testing of pilots and crew. We may already have this at Bristow, but the regulation change may become changes to our written procedures. Many people will be aware of the current Part 66 licensing. B1, B2, A3 and C are already in place. New license changes include the B3 for light aircraft, the B2L for light aircraft avionics, and the L license for gliders and sailplanes. So the current regulation tree looks like this. ICAO and the SARPs are fed to all countries around the world, including the FAA and the UK, and also to EASA and their member states. Airworthiness directives issued by the UK CAA, the FAA or EASA must be embodied on our aircraft. If we were not to do this, then the aircraft would not be able to fly legally. When dealing with the regulation tree and Bristow, the interpretation of the UK regulations and EASA regulations is carried out through the Bristow QID manual system. These manuals have an unusual numbering system, but you can see from this chart that they derive their information from the regulations that we all should be following. In this way, if employees follow the QID manuals which are relevant to them, then therefore they will be following the EASA and the UK CAA regulations precisely. Great, that's the end of part 1. Now move on to part 2. See you soon.